Good afternoon. Today I'd like to talk to you guys about what DEI is. Because first we have to define what it is that we're talking about. As you can see on the PowerPoint, we have some bullets briefly explaining what it is, but I'm going to go into it a little bit more in depth. It's more than just the differences diversity can be explained between gender and ethnicity. People had different experiences growing up, whether they grew up in different parts of the country, or they grew up in different socioeconomic conditions, and because of that, they have unique, different experiences in how they approach problem solving and creative thinking, which allows for a more diverse atmosphere. And when you have a more diverse atmosphere, especially within a company, you have a better workforce and can be more aligned to company goals. Equity is the preposition that people should be treated according to their backgrounds, which is true. Why? Because what happens if somebody is 6 foot tall and they want to go play basketball? They're closer to the net than someone who's 5 feet tall. Now that might just be a little bit of a silly example in the sense of you're not going to go and say that the guy should get a bouncy trampoline, so when he's playing basketball he gets to score higher. But on a macro level, when you're talking about societal issues, when you have someone who's so far back from the starting line, what you would want to do is if they can't see over a fence, and this is a common picture that's seen when it's talking about equity, where one person only needs 1 block to see over a fence, but someone else needs 3 blocks to see over the fence, it doesn't take away from the other person the fact that this other person got more blocks. It's giving somebody what they need based on their unique background, which once again leads to better results for companies as you have a more aligned, cohesive workforce, which then translates into inclusion, which is where a space inside of a company and a society where everyone is welcome. Now, why is it important in the workforce? There has been much research that shows that DEI is a strategic advantage in the workforce. There were some studies that I saw when I was researching this that shows that on the upper level management, the more diverse that it is, they are, I think it was 25% more likely to have higher profitability margins compared to their counterparts. So besides for all the social reasons and ethical reasons and moral reasons, there are financial reasons as well why DEI can be very conducive for a company. And if you think about it, it makes sense. If you have people with unique experiences and unique backgrounds at upper management levels in a company or even mid-level managements of a company, and they can then collaborate more cohesively and in a way that allows for more effective and efficient problem solving, that can impact the company's bottom line. So it really only makes sense that a company, especially in a private company, but more so in a public company, you would want to reflect that diverse workforce in such a way that it is going to have an impact on the company's bottom line. Now, ERG groups stand for Employee Resource Groups. Okay, what they really do is work on culture. How so? It works on professional development amongst a diverse workforce. You find leaders and you train these leaders on setting the goals, maintaining a group identity within a company, which again leads to a better bottom line as you have more effective and efficient company goals and alignments between the workforce and the goals that the company has, whether it's financial, moral, or ethical. Now, you can't force anyone into doing it. They're usually volunteers, but that's totally fine because if the benefits are there for everybody, you'll have volunteers. It also positively impacts the bottom line because if it's employee led and it's volunteers, that means that people are feeling more inclusive and valued within the company. They're more likely to stay, which has an impact on employee retention. So the less you have to hire and the longer that people stay, the better off that the company is going to be. Additionally, the people who do volunteer for it, they can develop leadership skills. You can have a mentor-mentee relationship, which again can increase the efficiency of the company. You can have these people engage in more career advancement goals, which again works out for the company on the bottom line because the more trained a person is working towards their goals, and they reach those goals, it benefits them, which overall benefits the company. There was a survey that said in the younger generation, Generation Z now, I think it was 70% of them were more likely to apply for a job with companies that have ERGs, and I think it was over half would stay at companies that have ERGs. And recruitment and retention is a big issue nowadays. And this also bleeds into innovation. When you have people who are motivated because they're being rewarded, then they're more motivated. And this can inform the company's policies in many different ways. And it can influence organizational policies in many different ways. Now, corporate social responsibility is the other side of the same coin as DEI. And they are not in conflict because they both have similar goals. They want to achieve innovation and they want to enhance the workforce. Many advantages to this. You have problem solving, because if a company inculcates within its employees social values, okay, which is essentially the same thing as what DEI is trying to do, then these companies will lead to improved decision making and more creative solutions, because the more diverse workforce you have, the more company values that the company espouses, the more that people will work on trying to achieve those values. Because you have a more diverse workforce, you will have the company can build trust within the community, especially if it hires within the community, which aligns the business with the values of the community, which once again leads to a better workforce and a better output. You have improved employee retention and engagement. Same thing as what you had earlier with a more diverse workforce. When you have a company that has a corporate social responsibility, instead of, an oil company, say, dumping oil into the water and polluting, wildlife and the fishes, then you have a company that people can be proud of and they want to work towards more. And it also leads to lower rates of employee turnover, which can increase the company's bottom line.
Now that you've learned what diversity, equity, and inclusion means, let's talk about compliance frameworks related to DEI. Let's first discuss the importance of DEI compliance. Compliance with DEI standards and regulations is critical for fostering an ethical workplace and minimizing legal risks. It ensures that organizations adhere to laws that safeguard against discrimination while promoting a culture of respect and equity. We'll discuss an overview of some of the relevant laws and legislation in order for you to develop a familiarity with pertinent legislation, which will provide a framework of understanding when you build your DEI initiatives. It'll help you remain in compliance with your obligations and guide those DEI strategies. Some legal foundations that are important to be aware of when ensuring DEI compliance are federal laws like Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and the ADEA, all of which prohibit discrimination based on race, sex, disability, and age, among other protected classes. It's also important to be aware of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC, which provides guidance to ensure DEI programs do not result in unlawful discrimination. The EEOC is a labor protection regulator. But here's your compliance imperative. Organizations must design efforts related to DEI that promote inclusivity without violating anti-discrimination laws. And really, these are two sides of the same coin, because diversity, equity, and inclusion at its core is about protecting these protected classes. It's about looking at people that are in a position in which they're at a disadvantage and allowing them to start at the same spot as everyone else. However, in attempting to implement different strategies for diversity, equity, and inclusion, some argue that these initiatives have gone too far and are now discriminating against non-protected classes. Some people argue that rather than diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, businesses should shift more towards a meritocracy. And it's important to be aware of all of these different perspectives because they inform how you will develop your own diversity, equity, and inclusion policies. One way to be sure that your DEI policy is in the best position is to be aware of future trends in DEI and compliance. it's important to adapt to a dynamic legal environment. While all legal environments tend to shift rapidly with the ebbs and flows of different administrations, the DEI regulatory environment has been continuously evolving as of late, alongside shifting societal expectations and shifting presidential and political considerations. Organizations must remain vigilant in monitoring legislative developments, judicial rulings, and public perception, which influence DEI obligations and permissible practices. If you want to ensure that you are DEI compliant, then you want to make sure that you are up to date on what is required in order to remain DEI compliant. And that is especially difficult with this ever-changing regulatory environment. One way that you can set yourself up for success is by implementing forward-thinking DEI approaches. If you want to maintain a competitive edge, adopt these forward-looking DEI strategies that not only meet current legal standards, but also keep in mind certain aspects of your DEI initiative that may be an issue in the future. If you can nip things in the bud early on, then you set yourself at a distinct advantage over companies that are still lagging behind in these areas.
So now we will explore the political landscape and controversies when it comes to DEI. So first, let's begin with President Trump's executive order that he signed on January 21st. This executive order represents the most sweeping federal rollback of DEI policy to date. It formally eliminates all diversity, equity, and inclusion mandates across the federal government. That includes DEI trainings, funding for DEI offices, and any policies that take into account race, sex, or other protected characteristics in decision-making. More than just ending DEI for federal employees, this executive order prohibits the use of identity-based considerations in any federal employment, contracting, or grant-making process. That directly impacts how the Department of Education, or the Department of Labor, and other federal agencies assess compliance with civil rights obligations. What's more, the order empowers federal agencies to investigate private companies and institutions that continue DEI-based hiring. The language used in the executive order equates such practices with unlawful discrimination. It is also specifically directs the Office of Management and Budget to ensure no federal funds are used for DEI purposes. So in effect, this order seeks to reframe equal opportunity as strictly merit-based and identity blind, even as critics argue that it fails to account for systemic barriers to access. The executive order builds on broader legal and political backlash to DEI efforts that have been gaining momentum for several years. One pivotal moment was the United States Supreme Court's decision against Harvard, which struck down its race-conscious admissions policies under the Equal Protection Clause. That case provided the legal rationale for challenging DEI in other sectors. Since then, legal challenges have targeted corporate DEI hiring goals, supplier diversity programs, and employee resource groups. So for example, America First Legal has filed complaints with the EEOC against companies like Morgan Stanley, alleging that their DEI practices violated Title VII. At the state level, we've seen a wave of legislation restrictions. Texas, for example, banned DEI offices in public universities in 2023. These laws create a fractured legal landscape. What's permitted in California may be banned in Texas, forcing national companies to tailor their DEI strategies on a state-by-state basis. In response, many companies are scaling back identity-based programs in favor of broader language surrounding, for example, belonging or respect and inclusive culture. Others are conducting internal audits to ensure that their programs don't cross legal lines. So beyond the courts and legislatures, DEI has become a major flashpoint in the court of public opinion. Corporations have increasingly found themselves caught in political crossfire over their DEI commitments. So for example, Target. In 2023 and 2024, the company faced coordinated backlash over its LGBTQ inclusive merchandise and its broader DEI branding. Activist groups accused the company of, quote, woke capitalism, while others accused it of walking back its commitment too quickly. Target responded by pulling certain merchandise from its shelves and adjusting its DEI language in public-facing materials. This illustrates a broader trend. Companies are under pressure from both sides. You have advocacy groups demanding more robust DEI commitments, and the other side, you have political actors or customers threatening boycotts if they preserve DEI. Even brands like Bud Light or Disney have faced DEI backlash, showing how DEI has become a cultural flashpoint that directly affects brand perception, consumer loyalty, and even the stock price. So how should organizations move forward? They're now faced with a balancing act. Continue to support inclusive environments while navigating legal, political, and reputational minefields. The most forward-looking companies are rethinking their language, shifting from identity-conscious frameworks to principles that focus on fairness, respect, and shared values. For instance, some organizations are replacing race-specific hiring targets with goals focused on expanding access to opportunity, such as outreach to underdeserved communities or removing degree requirements for certain roles. Engagement is also becoming more nuanced. Leading organizations are using stakeholder mapping to better understand their employee base, customer demographics, and investor expectations. This helps them craft DEI strategies that are evidence-based and less vulnerable to claims of bias or exclusion. Ultimately, DEI isn't disappearing, but it is undergoing a profound transformation. Organizations that treat it as a compliance checklist will likely struggle. Those that treat it as a strategic business and values conversations will be better positioned to lead in a polarized environment.
So, you've decided that you want to implement DEI in your business. I'm here to discuss with you best practices for doing so efficiently and responsibly. So the first step, which a lot of companies overlook, is knowing your audience and your goals. Context really matters. And what I mean by that is DEI success. The success of a DEI program is not cookie cutter. It may look different in one organization than it would in another organization. And that is because every organization has different stakeholders. And that can be anybody from shareholders, leadership, executives or the board, employees, clients or customers, anyone, the general public, etc. And priorities. Some people prioritize growth and profitability. Some care more about compliance, some reputation management. Some just take, principled stances. They believe in something and, nothing else really matters. Sort of a human rights based perspective in certain situations. But with all of these different players, each having different goals and aims and beliefs, there are varying perspectives and justifications. And one example, moral versus legal. Some players within a company or outside a company may see DEI as entirely necessary. It is ethically required, for the purposes of equity and justice. It is a non-negotiable. Others, on the other hand, may just view it as a tool to avoid risk. They don't necessarily believe in the ideology of DEI, but they don't want to deal with people complaining about them not doing it. It's really two sides of the same coin in certain situations based on this first step here, knowing your audience and your goals. My colleague mentioned the Target situation on a previous slide. They are subject to a derivative suit based on shareholders believing the company lost value due to its DEI initiatives. Whereas on the other hand, Lululemon is being sued for the exact opposite. another derivative suit based on DEI, but Lululemon shareholders claim that the company's not doing enough. So you need to figure out what your goals are and who your audience is before making any decisions. But let's assume you're going to move forward. So some best practices. We thought it would be a good idea to use the COSO risk management framework. It allows companies to essentially evaluate themselves from a compliance perspective, generally as well, not specifically compliance, but generally evaluating risks. So we thought, again, it would be a good idea to discuss some best practices for implementing DEI from a risk mitigation perspective. So the first COSO pillar is governance and culture. So the tone starts at the top and works its way down an organization. So some best practices, weaving DEI into high-level oversight functions. Maybe you want to have a DEI board committee, or an executive who is the chief of inclusion or something like that. You want to embed DEI principles into compensation structures, into all of the company messaging, mission statements, policies, etc. Because this can't just be another obligation or a quota that employees feel they have to meet, or you don't want employees feeling like they have to just check a box. They're not actually invested. So you want to instill these values. It almost has to be like a cultural movement within the company. Everybody has to be on board and invested. And another way to facilitate that is by specifying employees' roles. Get them involved. Let them know how they impact the company's greater DEI efforts. And similarly, you have to cultivate channels for reporting. If you have whistleblower procedures within the company already, include DEI in them. If you don't, create them. There needs to be an environment where employees feel that they can speak up and that they won't experience consequences for speaking up. And then the next COSO pillar is strategy and objective setting. So again, conceptually, you want to align DEI with your legal and business goals. I kind of mentioned the getting away from it being just a check box type of setup. You want to use goals and values rather than specific quotas and metrics. And that will help you be compliant with some of the laws we discussed previously, like Title VII, ADA. So you want to have things like voluntary participation. Employees are not required to participate if they don't, align with the values of the system or the initiative. And then you also want to consider geography and, industry standards. Some state laws may vary, they have conflicting obligations regarding DEI. Some states may, be following closely the Trump regime's goals with DEI to essentially eradicate it, while other states may be pushing back. And then similarly, industry-specific concerns, in the medical field, there have been some allegations that there are groups that are underrepresented in clinical trials. So all of this, you have to take into account what type of business you're running, and again, like we discussed previously, who your audience is, the circumstances, the industry, geography, so that you can mitigate risk. You also want to include DEI and ESG reporting or planning. If you already are producing ESG reports or engaged with organizations that are advocating for ESG, some kind of cooperative fashion or something like that, it is a best practice to include DEI in that. And again, be proactive, engage compliance professionals before creating and implementing your AI system and while you're maintaining it, to ensure that whatever you're creating is compliant from the jump and that it remains compliant moving forward. So the next COSO framework is performance. And the two best practices we've highlighted here are training. This is critical. A DEI program and any ESG or compliance, any internal system that has to do with ideology or compliance controls, any internal system is only as effective as the people facilitating it and administering it. So there needs to be effective, value-oriented training for employees. This should be role-specific, scenario-based. If I'm a recruiter dealing with potential employees, my DEI concerns are going to be different than, a salesperson who is dealing with clients. You need to train on things like bias and sensitivity, again, specific to roles, and evaluate the training programs that you implement. Are they effective? Ask the employees, but anonymously, pre and post surveys, things like that. You need to get feedback to determine if the training is actually effective. And then including staffing mechanisms. We sort of touched on this before with weaving DEI principles into executive compensation, but just generally across the company. Again, maybe get away from quotas, concrete numbers, metrics per se, but implement equitable hiring and promotion procedures. So the fourth COSO pillar is review and revision. So of course you want to audit your DEI initiatives, maybe annually, maybe even more often. Some companies do this internally. Some companies engage third parties. And this is for the purpose of identifying, like we previously discussed, compensation or promotion discrepancies or disparities, across cultures and groups of people. Policy versus practice gaps. Our written policy, our company policy says this, but are we actually doing it? Legal exposure, things like that. And then similarly, you should adapt DEI initiatives based on, changes in circumstances, legal, political, social, etc. You want to monitor litigation. Maybe you do business in a state where there's a big case going up to the state Supreme Court because the state legislature, banned DEI training for employees in their state. So you want to obviously keep tabs on any major litigation and then recalibrate after you've done these audits, after you have a handle on, trends and changing political, social climates. Recalibrate based on what you know and based on what has changed. The fifth COSO pillar is information, communication, and reporting. We're going to accomplish this by, comprehensive feedback systems, communication systems. We discussed previously that employees need to feel like they can report incidents and speak up. And in the same way, there should be accessible, active channels for them to communicate with leadership, and leadership should communicate back with them. They should be transparent and responsive. There should be, again, fixed, anonymous feedback procedures, like maybe engagement surveys. And we already discussed the surveys regarding the effectiveness of training, exit interviews, things like that, to determine whether the employees think that things are fair and whether DEI initiatives or any other initiatives are effective. And then finally, reporting is always beneficial.